Today, we are jumping into one of the most high-stakes topics in the entire startup universe: equity. It's the stuff that builds empires, but it's also the very thing that can burn a company to the ground before it even has a chance. So yeah, let's get right into it. Let's just kick things off with a number that's, well, it's pretty staggering: 65%. That is the number of really promising startups that end up failing. And it's not because their product was bad or the market wasn't there. Nope. It's because the co-founders couldn't get along. And you want to guess what's at the heart of that conflict almost every single time? Yep, it's equity. And that brings us to the core idea of this whole explainer, what we're calling the equity paradox, because that's exactly what it is. Equity is, without a doubt, a startup's most powerful tool, and at the same time, it is its single greatest internal risk. Getting your head around that tension is the first step to, actually surviving it. And here it is, laid out plain and simple. Think of it like two sides of the same coin. On one side, equity is the engine. It's what you use to keep founders motivated, to bring in amazing talent, and to get the cash you need to grow. But on the other side, a fight over how to slice up that pie can totally poison relationships and just stop the whole company in its tracks.
Okay, so let's just make sure we're all working with the same definition here. What is equity really? Well, in the simplest terms, it's your piece of the pie. It's the ownership stake. It's what's left over after you pay off all the company's debts. So if your company is worth, say, 100 crores, but you have 20 crores in liabilities, the total equity is 80 crores. Your percentage of that is your equity.
Now, equity isn't just one thing. It plays three absolutely crucial roles. First, it's the number one financial incentive, right? It's that dream of a life-changing exit that makes all the insane risk of a startup feel worth it. Second, it's your secret weapon for attracting incredible people you couldn't possibly afford to pay in salary. Use stock options or ESOPs to make them owners alongside you. And third, it's literally the currency you use to raise money from investors. It is the lifeblood of the whole operation. Which, of course, leads us straight to what is probably the single most difficult, most awkward conversation any founder has to have. How do we split this thing up? To really get into this, let's use a classic example. We've got two co-founders, Madhu, who's the tech genius, and Kiran, the business whiz. So you've got Madhu's point of view, and you hear this a lot. She's thinking, hey, this whole thing was my idea. I'm the one actually coding and building the product. Without me, there is literally nothing. So naturally, she feels she deserves the majority of the equity. But then you've got Kiran, right? And she's arguing, look, a brilliant product that just sits on a server is worthless. My job, sales, marketing, bringing in actual money, that's what decides if we live or die in the long run. So of course, she also thinks she deserves the majority. So who's right? So what did they do? After all that, they decided on a 50-50 split. And the why here is everything. It wasn't about a spreadsheet or a formula. The decision was built on trust, on mutual respect, and on a shared promise that they'd be willing to talk about it again down the road if things changed. And this gets to a really, really important point. It's so easy to confuse equity with other things, but you shouldn't. It's not the same as your salary. It's not the only way to decide who has final say or control, and it's not the same thing as how you share profits. All those things can be handled separately. You got to think of equity as the ultimate scorecard for long-term risk and reward. So, if we know these conflicts are so common and so dangerous, how do we start to understand them? Well, it turns out most fights between founders really just come down to three simple things. We'll call them the 3 Rs. And if you know what they are, you can spot trouble way before it explodes. But hold on, before we get to the what of the conflict, there's the question of when. When do you even have this conversation? Do you split the equity right at the beginning, or do you wait? Look, splitting early gets that painful talk out of the way, which is great, but it's really hard to know what everyone's going to contribute down the line. It's usually best for founders who've done this before. Waiting lets you see how everyone performs, but man, it can create a ton of stress and uncertainty. That's often a better path for first-time founders who are still figuring it all out. Okay, here they are, the 3 Rs that cause most startups to blow up from the inside. First up, rewards. This is all about fights over equity and money. Next, roles. These are the turf wars over who's in charge of what and who has the final say. And finally, relationships. This is the special kind of chaos that happens when you mix business with friends and family. And that third R, man, that's often the most dangerous one. And why is that? It's because of this right here. We hate having those tough, awkward conversations about money and power with the people we're closest to. We just assume it'll all work out. And by the time we figure out it's not working out, things have often gone way too far. All right, so we've laid out the problem, we've figured out the causes. Now let's talk about what to actually do about it. We've pulled together some of the best advice from seasoned founders and investors and boiled it down into a simple playbook for you. So what does the playbook say? Well, it's pretty straightforward. First, you have to communicate constantly. Over-communicate everything. Second, figure out who does what, but be ready to adapt. Third, and I love this piece of advice, date your co-founder before you marry them. Work on a small project together first to see if you're actually compatible. And finally, and this is so important, agree from day one that you will reevaluate the equity split later on. Now, let's get a dose of real-world advice from the people who write the checks. Investor Arjun Rao makes a fantastic point here. He says that while 50-50 feels fair and equal to founders, investors actually prefer to see an unequal split. Why? Because it tells them immediately who the leader is. It answers the question, when things get tough, who makes the final call? It reduces their risk.
So, if you take one thing away from all of this, let it be this. Your startup is going to change in ways you can't even imagine. People's roles will change. One founder might have to step back, another might have to step up in a huge way. So what feels perfectly fair on day one might feel deeply unfair in year 3. You have to build a plan to talk about it again. It's the only way to make it last.
And that really just leaves us with this one last question to chew on. When you're splitting equity, are you just solving a math problem, adding up contributions and skills, or are you really taking a test of the trust, the communication, and the respect you have for the people you're building this dream with? The truth is, it's probably both. Thanks for tuning in.